Women and girls are the majority of humanity. Across most cultures, women live longer than men and do most of some of the world's most essential work, including most of the responsibility for raising the world's children. But across the world, the roles for women in society, from economics to politics to religion to arts and culture, are often contentious issues, sometimes violently so. And in the United States, the election of Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton raised for many the specter of a failure or reversal of modern feminism. So, what is the state of feminism today in the U.S. and around the world? This episode of The Whole Truth was made possible by
Philadelphia's historic district is best known as America's birthplace. It might surprise you then that the oldest part of Philadelphia has the latest and greatest. In streets, parks, restaurants, and shops, you'll find vibrant energy all around. Learn more at visitphilly.com.
the Millspring Foundation, the Doran Family Foundation, Amatec, and by
For hundreds of years in English-speaking courtrooms around the world, people have sworn an oath to tell not only the truth, but rather the whole truth. The oath reflects the wisdom that failing to tell all of a story can be as effective as lying if your goal is to make the facts support your point of view. In the courtroom, the search for truth also relies on advocates advancing firm, contradictory arguments and doing so with decorum. All of these apply to the court of public opinion, what John Stuart Mill called the marketplace of ideas. This series is a place in which the competing voices on the most important issues of our time are challenged and set into meaningful context so that viewers like you can decide for themselves the whole truth. Most Americans, indeed most human beings, are women and girls. Yet issues spanning from domestic politics to global geopolitics still seem to hinge very significantly around the question of the proper roles of women in society. In the decade after the American Civil War, African American men had the right to vote and often achieved high office, 50 years before women of any color were allowed to vote in this country. Many see as one of the greatest fault lines in global affairs today, in the conflict between the West and the jihadi movements in the Islamic world, to be conflicting values about the role of women. And of course, last year, the United States elected a man who, at the very least, made controversial statements about women, a man who opposed the first female presidential nominee of a major party, a nominee who had devoted her life to the cause of feminism and who embodied the cause. Did Donald Trump's victory mean a defeat for feminism? Joining us on The Whole Truth to discuss these issues today are Carrie Lukas, Managing Director of the Independent Women's Forum, Jarune Uwujaren, Editor of the Daily Progressive, Manal Omar, Associate Vice President for the Center for Middle East and Africa at the United States Institute of Peace, who we welcome back to The Whole Truth, and Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, University Professor of Humanities at Columbia University. Glad to see you. This is could not be a more current topic. Not so long ago, the United States had an election which transfixed the world. For the first time, the United States, a major party in the United States, nominated a female. This is a female who has embodied the feminist cause for a long time. What is the condition of feminism in this country as a consequence of the election, would you say? Has something changed, or do you see continuity?
Well, I think that we need to, again, remember what we're talking about. Are we talking about women, or are we talking about feminism? Because I think that the feminist movement is no longer just about women. It's much more about the left and about pushing forward a progressive vision of how the world should go. Let's remember, 42% of women in America voted for Trump. And they did so because they thought that he had a better chance at improving their condition and the conditions of the country than Mrs. Clinton did. You know, I think it's in my mind when I kind of step back, and especially when I step back and look at things from what I consider as the original feminist ideals, I don't know that Mrs. Clinton was really the embodiment of feminism and what I see as feminism. Remember, she was a woman who, who was the first lady. She kind of came to prominence based on her husband. She accepted a lot of bad behavior from her husband and stood by him. You know, I'm not sure. I think a lot of Americans got tired of this being, of Mrs. Clinton being kind of shoved down their throats as if every woman has to vote for Mrs. Clinton or else you're not a good woman or a good feminist or you don't believe in women's rights. I didn't look at gender and think that's how it's going to determine my vote, and I think a lot of women didn't either.
So I actually agree with you on a lot of points in terms of talking about whether or not candidates represent us. The question of whether Hillary Clinton represents feminism, I think, is a question of what you consider feminism. And I think rather than talking about feminism as this one cohesive movement, we need to think of feminisms, plural, because there are many ways of doing feminism, and Hillary Clinton's is one, but there are so many more that are rising up and that are based around different ideas than maybe someone like Hillary Clinton would espouse. I think there are a lot of people who practice their women's rights from a place where they're standing. So, you know, they might not call themselves feminists, but they're very much about, I want to uplift women in the Black community, or I want to uplift women by paying particular attention to poverty, or, you know, and there are many ways to do feminism, and there are many variations of feminism. There's radical feminism. There's more mainstream progressive feminism. I don't think if Hillary Clinton had won, she would have made the country more feminist by default. I think she would have definitely been a historic president in the same way Barack Obama was. But we see that Barack Obama was president for 8 years, and we've had huge conflicts in the Black community. And so we can't just sit there and say, because of what this person looks like, they're good for all of us. We have to also look at what's happening in Congress, what's happening on the local level. Are these people actually looking out for, you know, the smallest among us and the most vulnerable, or are they kind of politically motivated and career motivated in the way that many politicians are?
Carrie's number is a very striking one, this 42%. It brings to mind an adage that I heard in the wake of the election, which is that Secretary Clinton ran as a woman, but she was evaluated as a candidate, which in many ways may be a marker of great progress in this country. After all, in the final analysis, we all wish to be judged on the basis of what we bring to the table. But in other words, what you did not see in 2016 was anything like, say, a Catholic referendum that you saw in 1960. John Kennedy, ironically, denying that Catholicism had any bearing on the 1960 election, carried like 85 or 90% of the Catholic vote, which has not happened since. But what would you say, Dr. Spivak?
Well, I kind of agree with you about judgment. You know, I think democracy is about judgment. You don't vote for everyone, you have to judge. And to an extent, the fact that 42% of women voted for Trump doesn't mean that much to me, because I'm not thinking about women and men. I'm thinking about an electorate that has judgment, because democracy is not just about my rights. It's also about equality with people who do not resemble me at all. Equality with people, so that to make a binary division, although I completely understand where you're coming from, between women and the left, I think it's a mistake, because those are big general words. We really ought to be thinking of coming together. And I'll just say this, that part of what one does is try to educate the electorate. In this country, there is such an incredible decrease in education, across the board, at the top as well as at the bottom, of thinking about values and so on. It's all STEM now. No, like in New York City high schools, languages are gone. Those are the instruments with which we are able to imagine people who do not resemble us at all. So women, because they voted for their rights, 42% of them voted for Trump, that's not how we educate an electorate.
Well, I like your word, judgment, because judgment is a word that implies many, many considerations, often inarticulate. And you're talking about feminism as a very broad tent, many variations on it. But what would you say?
Well, I mean, I would definitely start by saying I'm a proud feminist, understanding that I get to define that term. Nobody defines it for me. And I would say, you know, I don't believe in domestic and foreign policies anymore. The world is coming together. Those lines are being blurred. And I really see our humanity more and more. And I think that the patriarchy has used borders and nationalism and religion to divide us. And it really saddens me to think about a line I've heard women say in conflict zones over and over. And I first heard it in Iraq, but I remember hearing it in Nigeria and other places where they said, we always talked about leaping forward. We didn't think we would have to fight for the status quo. And on November 9th, that line hit me so hard because I realized that as an American woman, I was now in that position of where we're no longer talking about leaping forward by breaking the big glass ceiling of a female president, but we're talking about keeping the rights we've always had. And so I think that's the reality. I took all of the attacks on Hillary quite personally. I felt like they were talking about my mother. And I'm Palestinian, so obviously I don't agree with all of Hillary Clinton's foreign policies and a lot of her domestic policies, but the criticism I felt was not fair compared to other male candidates. And I felt she was being held by women to a higher standard than we hold male candidates. And I see this in foreign countries. You know, I hear women who are doctors and engineers say, we're not qualified to be a member of parliament, we're not running, and then an illiterate tribal leader is sitting and filling parliament. So our standards for women is, I mean, they have to be at the highest level for us to accept them. And that's the final goal of patriarchy, is when minorities attack other minorities. And again, I think really looking at where I work, which is predominantly in war zones, I've seen women really step up in a very powerful way because they don't have the luxury of victimhood. And I think for me, that's really what I learned from women. But we have to show up.
One of the things that I thought was a very interesting feature of the Clinton speech habit in 2016 was that President Trump was running on an America First platform, and she joined issue on that when she spoke of her commitment to women and so forth. She did so in a very transnational way, erasing boundaries everywhere, as though the whole question of feminism, in a sense, is something that which leaps borders. Do you feel a solidarity with women elsewhere in other societies? How do you feel about that?
But, you know, I think that I mentioned to everyone before we started the show that that I had been living in Germany until this summer. And I think there was a real tension in Germany with this idea of they were very welcoming of refugees, and the feminists in general, the organized feminists, were very pro the refugees. But then there was this very awkward moment where what did that mean for women's rights? Because women in Germany were suffering an enormous uptick in sexual violence. There was a new push for a lot of the refugee men wouldn't accept female doctors. They wanted to have women separated and have these separate quarters. And I know that there was a lot of Germans who were saying, wait a second, you know, this isn't what Germany's about. And there was this real tension. And there was a feeling that a lot of leading feminists there didn't want to talk about it, and they were very uncomfortable with it and had this politically correct desire to wish that away. And there was a lot of normal German women who said, wait, you know, this is what the step back is. When you're talking about what we're going to lose here, I think that it is this political correctness, and often pushed by feminism as a leading kind of enforcer of that was making us, which threatened women. And I think that there's a lot of people in America today who look at what's happened and some of the problems that we're having and feel as though when you look at what's going on in college campuses and this lack of a serious education, well, I think a lot of people are saying that feminism has distracted people and has become kind of the police that is not allowing us to have free speech. I think that's the kind of thing, and this elitism when we're talking about, oh, we need to educate people down there. A lot of people are saying, you know what, Washington and the people in liberal universities, they don't know what my life is like. And they say that, you know, that you treat women and men as if they need to be lectured to.
The changing status between, or changing roles between men and women touches every household, every person on Earth. It's an incredible story. Now, does a change like that happen spontaneously? How important, would you say, is the organized political branch of this, which you've raised? In other words, we encounter this. We understand that this is a political force as well as a phenomenon.
So there is a lot of nuance to this issue because it's not only what's happening up here, but also people in their own communities. and the way they speak to each other about women's roles and the way that they understand their own roles. I'm the only international perspective I can speak to is as a child of immigrants from Nigeria. I'm like 2 generations away from polygamy and a very different way of doing things. So when you talk about what feminism looks like and what women's rights looks like, you have to kind of take into this, you have to kind of acknowledge the fact that it's not this simple issue where everything looks the way it looks in the West or everything moves in this linear fashion forward. A lot of feminist thought comes from this area. It comes from the United States, it comes from Europe. It's kind of being applied to other cultures in a way that doesn't necessarily gel with those cultures. And so there's a complication there when you're talking about global feminism. Like you're having to deal with the fact that much of the writing, much of the thought is coming from the West and kind of being filtered through other cultures.
Well, so from the perspective of the Institute of Peace, what is the kind of resistance you encounter to this in other countries, and what are the consequences of that resistance for peace?
Well, I think that, a lot of the research shows that by targeting women, more than 50% of the population, you're not only able to build sustainable peace, you are talking about economic growth and investment in all aspects of society. And, the research has really shown that. But I also like to really emphasize how it's important to security and stabilization. Yeah. Women know their communities, they know their neighborhoods, they know their homes. So, for example, with foreign fighters, women are the first to say, hey, we don't know that boy. He doesn't belong to a family in this village. And so if we were actually paying attention, women raise the red flags, and I call them kind of the canaries in the mine in conflict. Oftentimes we dismiss it as women's issues rather than an indicator of early detection warning signs for violence, and that's the way I try to bring it. Particularly, you'll see women who have good relationships with the police or with whatever the local security force. If they trust them, they'll tip them off. If they don't trust them because the police will wipe in and take all the boys in the village or all the boys in the neighborhood, then of course they're not going to tip them off. So that's kind of the tension. The other thing I often say is women are always told not now. We've got to, and I've heard this, we've got to stabilize the country. As soon as I stabilize the country, and I've heard this from our own military, I'll come and I'll talk about your women and I'll talk about women's rights. And my answer is always the same. You're not going to stabilize the country. You will not stabilize Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and Syria until you talk about the women. And I think that kind of ability to dismiss women is really what we're catching ourselves in the security sector. That's what we're doing wrong. We need to target women as our allies and our partners.
This is one of the great changes of my life, and I think it's one of the most consequential issues looking forward into the 21st century for peace at home and peace abroad. I appreciate your perspectives on this, and I would like to ask everybody here in conclusion to consider the following, and that is, what vision would you have for a young woman in the 21st century? And is that necessarily an American vision, or is that a vision of someone that you envision somewhere else? What is the unfinished business before feminism today? I think all of us agree, and it's implicit in this discussion, this is in progress. This is something that's not complete around the world. So what's the unfinished business, but what is your vision looking forward?
I feel like when we think about how far we've come, and just in my lifetime, I think you've seen such changes and the possibilities. I have three young daughters, and they don't. It wouldn't even make sense to them, this idea that that the choices that they can make or the futures that they have would be different from their brothers. So I think we're moving this way in the United States and towards this idea of women having being able to pursue the life that they wish. And fulfill their dreams, whether that's becoming the CEO or the President of the United States, or if it's to become a mother and somebody who primarily stays at home. I think that's a legitimate choice, and we need to not kind of overlook that. It sometimes troubles me in the feminist movement that we, by an understandable desire not to limit women to this idea of the value of motherhood, that we try to denigrate this role, which is, again, one of the most fulfilling, what many women would say that for their families is the most fulfilling aspect of their life.
What would you say?
So the vision I would have for young women looking at America specifically is for women of all walks of life, whether they came up in poverty, whether they're women of color, whether they're Black women, like any kind of woman, to be able to have access to the same rights as every kind of man. Because what you see in the United States is there's not only gender-based issues, but there's also racial issues that affect women. There are issues of disability that affect women. So until all women are able to, have equal opportunities on those levels, then we aren't all equal.
I think I would agree with a lot that has been said. There have been divisions, but I also have some points, and I want to really build on something you said. I am also very critical of this, putting women separately, etc., etc. But I was in fact speaking in Berlin just after the refugees had been brought in, and I was very strongly criticizing German nationalism on the left and so on. So we don't want to create a kind of bogeyman called the left. Okay, I think that really does us harm, because we have been talking about the importance of motherhood, mothering, for a very long time. In fact, in Norway, I said that the one thing about democracy, the one slogan that really works and travels, and in fact, very theoretical feminists were against this. They said that this is liberal biopolitics, if you can understand that phrase. But what I had said was that other people's children, this particular slogan, travels from the absolutely poor. I have 6 elementary schools among people who have nothing. Their children play with bricks, okay? They have nothing to play with. So other people's children, it travels from the absolute bottom to the absolute top as a kind of slogan for democratic thinking. And therefore, I would say that when you are critical of the way in which other people are behaving, the point is not to say, hey, that is not, to take your word, that is not normal German, but to recognize that within those groups, there are people who are very critical of it also. I was speaking to someone from Tunisia yesterday, and this is what we were talking about. The fact that there are critical movements within, you see, my sister and I talk about why are we like that? You know what I mean? And in order to be able to work with us, there are some people, it takes work. You can't just think of yourself as normal and look how badly they're behaving. Nothing is going to come out of that.
Well, now on the front lines, how does it look?
Well, I mean, I'm eager to hear and listen to the young vision that will be coming forward, and I think it will be a powerful vision. Instead, what I would do is share my 3 big lessons, is watch out for when people divide. There is always, and particularly patriarchy, there's always a reason for those divisions. It doesn't mean don't criticize, which would be my second lesson, is have the difficult conversations. I tell people, don't try to figure out what the scarf means to me. Don't try and figure out Sharia law. Just ask me. And so if you're not having the difficult conversations, we will not move forward towards unity. And I think the third area is, the trap of borders, of religion, of nationalism is the biggest trap that has divided women, and I think divided humanity. So really rise, and let's start challenging ourselves.
So there is a connection between the vision of, I would say, feminist visionaries and basically one world.
Yeah, and humanitarianism. I mean, I see it as it's really one issue. That's why I say women's rights are human rights, plain and simple.
Exactly. This has been a wonderful discussion. As I say, I just can't escape the feeling. 2 things. One is the importance of this question. And second, yes, it happens to be located on the left spectrum of the United States. I wonder how much of that is historical accident. The Republican Party in 1960 might have been a civil rights party. The Democrats make a decision to go for civil rights, and feminism ties in with it, and so forth. This is something that touches all of us. And it's certainly, going forward, something that we're going to be hearing about for the rest of our lives and probably for the rest of the century. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
On behalf of the whole truth, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
By supporting the strength of all society's most fundamental unit, the family, traditional roles for women, both in the United States and around the world, have surely contributed to the possibility of human progress. It is undeniable, however, that the public institutions of our society and of most societies on earth have been run very disproportionately by men. No one believes that there is a genetic reason in today's economy and society to do other than invite the full participation of women in professional and public life. No doubt, the rise of women has accelerated human progress. Yet these issues about the roles for women and girls in society cut to the core of deeply held beliefs about identity, about religion, and about political economy. So what does feminism mean in the age of Trump and Clinton? What does feminism mean in an age of conflict between the self-styled modern West against religious fundamentalism? The whole truth of this question seems to me to be that the changing role of women around the world will be, as much as any, the defining question of the 21st century. I am David Eisenhower. Thank you very much for watching The Whole Truth.
This episode of The Whole Truth was made possible by
Philadelphia's historic district is best known as America's birthplace. It might surprise you then that the oldest part of Philadelphia has the latest and greatest. In streets, parks, restaurants, and shops, you'll find vibrant energy all around. Learn more at visitphilly.com.
the Millspring Foundation, the Doran Family Foundation, Amatec, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.